Meg Penny studied the oversized crystalline paperweight she held in her hands. She lay in her bed, the room lit only by a dim lamp on her desk. What was the name of that song? Oh yeah, Make the World Go Away. That was the way she felt now. She just wanted to sit here and just switch everything off. She tried staring into the paperweight, placing herself inside the quiet, snow-filled scene. It had always been her way of escaping. Tonight, though, it wasn't working. Tonight her mind seemed fixed on what she had seen. That thing, that awful thing, carrying Paul Tyler away. She shuddered and gasped, tried to pull the thought from her head, even as she heard her parents' voice drifting up from the stairs below her. I knew I shouldn't have let her go out with that little son of a bitch in the first place, her father was saying, his voice tight and hoarse. Lower your voice, her mother cautioned. That boy's probably dead. Dead. The word pounded in Meg's mind. Dead. I want to know what happened out there tonight. Whatever it was, you can bet that Flag kid was behind it, her father said harshly. It's about time they nailed that little psychopath. His ass is going to fry for this. Believe me. Brian Flag. It was Brian her father was talking about, and he was wrong. Of that Meg was certain. She thought he was a hood too, but she knew he hadn't done anything to do with tonight's horrors. She'd seen it in his eyes. He looked tough on the outside, sure, but his eyes showed a confusion, even a kind of vulnerability. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. The door opened. Meg turned and saw her mother, a glass of water in her hand, something unseen cupped in the other hand. Probably Valium. Her mother swore by the stuff to get you through times of trauma. Mrs. Penny sat on the bed. Here, Meg, she said. Take this. I don't want it. Come on, honey. You need to sleep. Meg sat up. Sure enough, there was a tiny Valium pill in Mom's hand. Meg took it and put it in her mouth. She took a sip of water, but she did not swallow the Valium. That's a good girl, said Mrs. Penny. Now, not another word. I'm sure the police will have this thing settled by morning. She kissed her daughter's forehead and went to the door. Mom, called Meg after her. You don't believe me either, do you? You're home now. You're safe. That's all that matters. Mrs. Penny shut the door behind her as she left. Immediately Meg sat up and spit the bitter Valium out into her hand. She tossed it away. What they had said about Brian Flagg was all wrong. The poor guy, they were going to pin the blame on him. The blame for what had happened to Paul and the can man. They didn't believe her about the creature, and they were going to punish Brian Flagg. She couldn't allow that. She had to help Brian. She alone had seen what had really killed twice already tonight. Maybe she could do something about stopping it from killing again. She got up and started dressing. She'd done it before, sneaking out through the bedroom window, down a low-slung roof, down the drain pipe to the grass below. They hadn't caught her then, and they wouldn't catch her now. If there was something she could do to help, she had to do it. It was her responsibility to the community, and it was her responsibility to Paul and to Brian Flagg. Quickly, she slipped on her old jeans. It was bigger now, filled with the flesh and blood and bones of 4 people, but it was still hungry. Behind it, the wheeled vehicle steamed in the moonlight as it crept along the ground like a rolling oceanless wave. The remains of its most recent victims roiled about its interior in a most satisfactory way. The illumination from the moon picked out the tumble of Scott Chesky's school ring, the rolling of bones stripped of flesh, the wash of blood. Down below the car, a squirrel skittered out, jumping up and perching on a falling tree. It lifted its perky little snout and sniffed the night air. It shuddered, skipped, peered around over the edge of the log. A ropey tentacle flicked out from the night, coiling around the squirrel. The squirrel squeaked and squealed as it was pulled toward the massive blot of protoplasm that was the blob. Then it was pulled into a vacuole. A hungry, diseased maw opened in the mass by the pseudopod and was swallowed up like a tasty after-dinner mint. Still, the blob was not satisfied. It flowed on and on through the woods. It caught a bird, and it caught a snake, and it caught another bird, and it popped them into its mass and absorbed them. Finally, it reached a hole near the road where it sensed a warm shelter of darkness. Slithering and reforming itself to fit, the blob slipped into the hole and into the sewers of Morgan City. The sheriff's station in Morgan City was a small one, cluttered with gray file cabinets, an old desk, and lots of police paraphernalia. It was a sight familiar to Brian Flagg. He thought of it as the waiting room of hell. He kept his eyes averted from the nearby holding cells. He had some grim memories of those cells, and he knew that is where he'd end up again. He sat now in a straight-back chair with Sheriff Geller and Deputy Briggs questioning him. He felt sullen and angry, and he barely heard what they were accusing of. Hell, it rained too hard in Morgan City these days. People seem to want to pin it on him. Deputy Briggs was asking the questions while Geller sat with his feet propped up on his desk, assuming his usual position of nonchalant authority. "Okay, Flag," said Briggs. "Let's hear it again." Brian looked up at the man, then sighed. "What's the use? They're going to pin this rap on me anyway." "Look at him," said Briggs. "He's too stupid to know how much trouble he's in." The deputy turned his back to Brian. "Why don't you wise up?" "I told you everything. I'm tired of hearing myself talk." "We're not boring you, are we?" said Briggs. "Bright kid like you?" Anger spilled out of Brian. "Look, am I under arrest or what? If I am, I want a lawyer." Briggs turned to the sheriff. "The man wants a lawyer," he said sarcastically. "Yeah, that's right," continued Brian. "And if you're not going to book me, I'd like to leave. Either way, I want you out of my face." That apparently tore it for Briggs. He grabbed Brian by the front of his jacket and dragged him up so they were nose to nose. "Oh yeah, hard-ass? I'm in your face to stay. What are you going to do about it?" Brian kissed him. Disgusted, Briggs pushed him back into the chair, wiped his mouth, and cocked his fist back. "You little shit, I'd have bust your head open." "Bill," interrupted the sheriff softly. That stopped Briggs, who realized he was out of line. If there were any heads to be busted around here, that was the sheriff's job. Briggs went back to work scrubbing his lips. Sally Jeffers waddled in. Sally, Brian knew, was the radio dispatch operator. He listened to what she had to say. Maybe this would clue him in on what was really going on. "Can't locate his mother," she said. "Well, we know his father's not around," said Geller. "Probably passed out drunk in some whorehouse somewhere," sneered Briggs. Brian clapped his hands. "Ooh, good one, Briggs. Call a shrink. I'm a broken man." The sheriff beckoned the deputy over, then pulled him to where he thought they were out of earshot. They weren't, however, and Brian could hear every word. "Turn him loose," said the sheriff. "Herb, we got eyewitnesses placing him at the scene of the crime," Deputy Briggs protested. "No motive, no evidence, not a spot of blood on him." "Flag's a punk, but he's no murderer." "I think it's a mistake." "Your objection is duly noted," said the sheriff. "Now turn him loose. We got work to do." Briggs sighed heavily and walked over to Brian. "Take a hike," he said. "Cripes, after all this hassle they put him through, they just wanted to scare him? It pissed him off. Gee, Brian, we're awfully sorry we troubled you. Seems we went and made a mistake." "Stupid us," Brian taunted. Briggs stuck a finger under Brian's nose. He was so angry he looked like he was ready to explode. "You're pushing your luck." "Go on, Flag," said Geller. "Get out of here before I change my mind." Brian got up and strode toward the door. He stopped and turned to the deputy. "You ought to change your lipstick, Briggs. It tastes like shit." He spun on his heels and cruised out. God, he was pissed. They'd haul him down there like this for nothing, and all because he tried to help that poor bastard, for Christ's sakes. The street was deserted, still dry and warm from the day's heat. His hands jammed into his pocket, Brian Flagg strode angrily along the sidewalk. He heard the muttering of a small motor behind him and turned around. A Volkswagen Bug, red, pulled up alongside of him. Meg Penny was at the wheel. "Brian," she said, "I need to talk to you." God, would they never stop hounding him? He wanted nothing to do with this chick. She was just trouble. He kept on walking. "Brian!" Meg called after him. She pulled the car over, turned off the ignition, and raced after him, finally catching up. "What the hell are you doing here?" Brian asked her. "I came down to bail you out." He couldn't believe his eyes. Meg was carrying a credit card in one of her hands, and she was showing it to him. Brian jabbed a finger back at the jail. "What do you think that is, Neiman Marcus? They don't take plastic." He took the card and slipped it into her shirt pocket, relaxing a bit. "Look, I appreciate the thought. I'll go home." "But I need to talk to you," Meg insisted. "I'm really sorry about your boyfriend. I really am. But I'm tired, I'm hungry, and I'm not in the mood for conversation." He swiveled around and headed off away from her. Up ahead, the neon of the Tick-Tock diner flashed invitingly, and Brian Flagg desperately wanted to put a cheeseburger into his gurgling stomach. He didn't hear her following him, and it surprised him when she was disappointed she hadn't. "You're getting soft, boyo," he told himself, and struck at a faster pace for the Tick-Tock. When he got there, Fran, the waitress, was still tending shop, cleaning up while George, the short-order cook, hauled out a mop and pail to clean up the tile. They looked as if they were closed for business, but Brian had to give it a try. He opened the door and headed straight for the counter. "George? Franny? Que pasa?" Fran flashed him a crooked smile. "Hey, hot shot, we're closed." Brian flopped onto a chair and leaned his chin into his hands. "Fran, please, I've been dumped on all day. Give me a break, huh?" Fran was cool. She liked to trade quips with him, and he enjoyed that. "Oh, what's the matter, dear? Tough day at the office?" She returned his grin and stuck a thumb behind her, indicating to the kitchen. "Well, grill's shut down. How about a sandwich?" He'd had his heart set on the cheeseburger, but his stomach would take anything at this point. "Beautiful," he said. "I'll just sit in one of these booths here. Get out of your way, George, okay?" He folded into a booth, trying to let the tension go from his muscles. He closed his eyes. Shit, what a day. If he could just forget everything. The next thing he knew, he heard the door fly open, followed by the sound of footsteps on tile and the thump of a fanny hitting the booth seat across from him. He opened his eyes, and there was Meg Penny. "Geez," he said, "you don't give up." "I need your help," she said insistently. "What a surprise, and I thought you came out of the goodness of your heart." "I came because I thought we could help each other." "In 3 years of school you haven't said shit to me, but now that you need my help, we're old buddies, huh?" She looked down. She knew he was right. She was one of the preppy chicks he'd tried to talk to before, but she'd given him the cold shoulder. Then and always. Now she spoke in a low, almost pleading voice. "Nobody believed me about what happened tonight." "What did happen?" "You were there, you saw," she said. "All I saw was an old man with a funky hand." And then Fran was there with a plate full of Lebanon bologna and cheese sandwich, along with a pile of chips and a flat dill pickle. His mouth watered at the smell of the vinegar and the mustard and the sweet scent of fresh chips, and she set it down in front of him. "Can I get you something, hun?" she asked Meg, looking at Brian as though to say, "What's a clean-cut looker like this doing hanging out with a guy like you?" "No thanks," said Meg. Fran shrugged and left. As Brian stuck a corner of the sandwich into his mouth, Meg leaned over to him, speaking in a low and desperate voice. "The thing on his hand, it killed him, and it killed Paul. And whatever it is, it's getting bigger. I saw it." Brian chewed, giving her a long, blank stare. After he swallowed, he said, "That's what you told the cops?" She nodded. "Can I ask you a personal question?" "Sure." "I know you're the homecoming queen type and all that, but are you a little strung out on something?" Her eyes lit up with anger. Her face trembled with frustration. "You're just the same," she said in a low, tight voice. "Huh? You act like you're different. You put on a big show. But you're just like everybody else in this town." She got up. "You're full of shit, Flag." She started to take off. That surprised him. What surprised him even more was his immediate reaction. He got up and grabbed her and gently but firmly pushed her back into the seat. "Hey, wait a second. Come on, take it easy." Suddenly she seemed to cave in, as though trying to hold back tears but not quite succeeding. Gradually they started leaking out down her cheeks and onto the formica tabletop. Brian took half of his sandwich he hadn't bitten into and offered it to her. "Here," he said, "eat something." She shook her head, refusing it. "Go ahead," he insisted. "You'll feel better." She took the half sandwich and started nibbling at it. Brian watched her for a moment. "I'm amazed," he said finally. "I never heard you say shit before. What was that like for you?" She looked at him oddly, and then couldn't help herself. She laughed, and Brian could see the nervous tension draining out of her face. "So go ahead, I'm listening," he said, softening his voice. "Tell me all about what happened, what you saw. I'm sorry I wasn't listening, but you gotta admit, if someone told you that that little bit of something on the can man's hand devoured 2 guys almost 6 feet tall, then you'd have a hard time believing it, wouldn't you?" She nodded. "Yeah, I guess maybe I would at that." "So, tell me what happened. Everything from the moment I left the clinic. I want to know. I really do." She nodded. She looked him straight in the eye, and she told him. As soon as they'd let Brian Flag go, Deputy Bill Briggs had been dispatched to return to the team of firemen and paramedics searching around the clinic grounds and nearby woods for the body of Paul Tyler. 45 minutes later, he reported in. "All we found," Briggs said with his walkie-talkie, "is lots of ground mist, trees, and a couple of dead rats. We're coming up empty, Sheriff, and we got our best searchlight sweeping the area. You want us to head back into the foothills?" Herb Geller sighed heavily, thought about it a moment, and decided against it. "Negative. I'd rather have you patrolling the streets. We'll start again at first light when the state police get here." 10-4, said Briggs, signing off. Herb hung the hand mic up and clicked the radio off. He rubbed his face warily. The springs of the chair squeaked as he leaned back in it. "A night to remember, this one," he thought. or rather a night to forget quickly soon as it got cleaned up. This shit had a weird quality he'd never seen back in the city. Something out of sync, out of whack. Sheriff Herb Geller didn't like it, not one bit, and he had the uneasy feeling that it was far from over. Just then Sally Jeffers entered, a steaming cup of coffee in her hand and an understanding smile on her face. "You look tired," she said, putting down the coffee. The smell of chicory, the warmth of steam, caressed his face as he picked up the cup and sipped. "Ah, been a long night, thanks." "Gonna be even longer," she said. "That's the truth," said Herb. Another sip of the coffee. He shook his head. "1 deputy and 6 volunteers. I feel like the one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest." "You've done all you can, Herb. This isn't your standard Friday night drunk." "Yeah, ain't that right," he thought. And then another thought occurred to him. He unbuttoned the flap to his shirt pocket and dug out the check on which Fran had scribbled her message. He stared at it a moment, admiring how nice the handwriting was, even though Fran had done it in a hurry. "I'm off at 11 o'clock. He glanced up at the clock. 10:45. "Something wrong?" Sally asked. "I'm just worried about a friend of mine," said Herb. "Guess I'm worried about everybody tonight." He squeaked out of his chair and got ready to go. "Think you can hold the fort down here for an hour or so, Sally?" "Sure, that's my job." "Good girl. I'll bring you back some donuts." "Aren't you going to finish your coffee, Sheriff?" He looked down at the coffee. "Yeah, I guess I better have a little more. Something tells me I might need it." He managed to drink about half of it down. It was a heavy-duty kitchen, the old-fashioned type, with zinc sinks and a mammoth grill, and chipped dishes skulking beneath the counters. Fran Hewitt had seen dozens like it in her waitressing peregrinations across the U.S. of A. Fran had always wanted to do something more than be a waitress, but it always seemed like the fastest and easiest way to do short-term work. Besides, it was the job she always found most available. She'd waitressed in L.A., in Denver, in New Jersey, all over the place. Wherever the men were, she went with whomever she was involved. There was Fran Hewitt, and she could only rely on a waitressing job, waiting for her at a long, big grill, a formica counter, greasy refrigerators, and a large industrial sink by the dishwashing contraption. She carried the last of the dirty dishes back to that sink now, looking forward to her date with Herb Geller, coming up in just a few minutes. Just a couple months ago, she wouldn't have gone out with him. Not that she hadn't liked his rugged western looks. No, she'd been living with Freddie Nichols then, the guy she'd come west with. Freddie was a ski instructor looking for work, but the job never really went anywhere, and so he had taken solace in lots of drugs and alcohol. Then in July, when he'd finally come out of his stupor, he'd just up and gone, leaving her in the lurch. Now she had to keep working here until she scraped up enough money to go somewhere else. Or got hitched with another man. With a sigh, Fran dumped the heavy plastic boxes onto the sideboard by the sink. George would deal with that mess. That was his job. And she'd be able to split this joint for her date with Sheriff Herb Geller. She'd gone out with cops before, but never with a sheriff. The idea intrigued her. Clump went the dishes, silverware rattling. And then she noticed the gurgling sound coming from the main sink. Fran walked over and looked down into the yawning basin. The drain was backing up. Filthy water was welling up a good 8 inches into the basin. Greasy bubbles broke the surface. God damn it, she thought. What a time for catastrophe to strike, before a big date. Usually it struck a few months after a big date. She sighed and grabbed a plunger from below the sink. Gotta deal with this before it gets worse, she thought. She was about to put the base of the plumber's helper down over the lips of the drain when George entered the kitchen. "Hey, didn't I hear something about a date with the sheriff?" George said. "That's right," she said. "You ain't got no time to be mucking around with that." George was a squat man of 40 or so, big and not handsome. He grabbed the plunger and smiled at her. "Now shoo." "Hey, knock yourself out," she said, smiling with thanks for his chivalry. The sink gurgled behind her as she left. "Fucking sink!" George was a short-order cook, not a plumber, but he could fix a sink or a john as good as anyone. All it was usually just some shit clogging up the pipes, figuratively or literally. George attacked the sink with the plunger, wanting to beat his record at quick solutions to life's little problems. Simple. That was George Ruiz's dictum for life. You have to stop being scared of it and then just go for the attack, and bango, your problem is solved. He put the black rubber base of the plunger down into the water and started plunging. The sink rattled and thumped, and the greasy water in the basin splashed around. After half a minute of serious plunging, he removed the plunger and took a look down at his handiwork. A couple of bubbles wavered up, nothing more. The sludgy water hadn't gone down an inch. "Hell," said George. What this place needed was a plumber's snake, but the owner was too cheap to get one. Still, maybe the obstruction was near the drain and he could work it out with his bare hand. George rolled back his shirt sleeve and stuck his hand in, all the way up to the elbow. He felt around down there, but his groping fingers didn't touch anything. What the hell could it be, he wondered. It must be farther down. He pulled his arm out and leaned over the sink, looking down into the drain, contemplating the problem. Maybe he could use a coat hanger, something that... A slimy red coil shot up from the drain. Before George could move away, the tentacle was wound around his neck and face like an insanely long frog's tongue. He was yanked head first into the mucky water with a great splash. Fran could tell the kids were having a heavy-duty conversation. As she approached, she could hear Brian Flagg saying, "Look, even if I were convinced, I'm the wrong guy to back you up. I'm not exactly Mr. Credibility in this town, you know." No, he wasn't, that's for sure, thought Fran. But she liked Brian. For some reason, despite the way he dressed and acted, she could see that he wasn't hardcore punk. After over 20 years of relationships with men, Fran Hewitt knew hardcore baddies all right. Brian Flagg wasn't one. Not yet, anyway. She arrived at their table and set down 2 plates she carried. One was a slice of pie. Brian looked up. "Gee, Fran, that sandwich busted me." "On the house," said Fran, getting a charge for being charitable with the boss's goods. "Eat up or I chuck 'em in the garbage." "I'm not proud," said Brian, pulling his plate closer and digging in. The girl, though, didn't touch hers. Fran gathered up the sandwich plate and went back to the kitchen. Weird seeing Brian Flagg with the corn-fed preppy sort, Fran thought. She's cute, though, and probably just what he needs to help straighten him out. She hit the swinging doors to the kitchen, calculating that if she could finish this stuff in under 5 minutes... She heard the sounds first. She turned the corner to where the view of the kitchen, as well as to the hallway leading to the office, stock rooms, and freezer in the back, was unobstructed. There was a body sticking out of the sink, legs kicking convulsively in the air, arms splashing out, great gobs of water onto the floor. George's body, George's legs, George's arms. And the water that splashed out, it was red with blood. Wrapped around the part of the torso still visible was a red slimy coat. Slime that rippled and sucked, dissolving skin and bone. Fran screamed. She had opened her mouth to cry for help, but a long, hard scream came out. Before she knew it, Brian Flagg and the girl had run into the kitchen, and they too stood frozen, looking at George Ruiz's body jerking and thrashing. God, something was dragging George down the drain, as if he were caught in a garbage disposal. "Fran," said Brian. "Oh, shit!" The girl gasped. The sink started to buckle. The pipes started to groan. Not knowing what else to do, Fran started forward to pull at George's legs to stop this insanity. Brian grabbed for her, but missed. She moved over to the other side of the room. "Don't touch it," he yelled. The legs of George Ruiz churned about wildly. The feet were swelling. One of the kicking shoes exploded in a spray of blood. The other foot had kicked free of its shoe. As the body was dragging further down the drain, the toes popped. Splat, 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 blood everywhere. Then George was gone. Fran looked at the damaged sink as a hush descended upon the room, unable to believe her eyes. She had taken some kind of drug that was giving her hallucinations? A drain pipe just didn't swallow a full-grown man. Brian and the girl were frozen too. Fran looked over to them as though for an explanation. And then hell really broke loose. Like a column of pus, something heaved out of the sink, shooting for the ceiling. On and on it unraveled, splattering onto the ceiling and sticking, growing in an upside-down mound of gunk, dripping with blood and steaming fluids. Fran smelled a terrible acid odor, cut with a tinge of the sewer. The thing clung to the ceiling, pulsating and oozing, hanging between Fran and the others. Brian Flagg held a hand out to her. "Fran, come on, over here!" But as though attracted to the motion of his arms, the bulbous nightmare on the ceiling shot out a web of tendrils, extending to the floor, cutting them off from her. And then the blob started oozing down. Nothing that Meg had said in describing what she'd seen prepared Brian for this creature that hung from the ceiling before him. No, it was infinitely worse than what Meg Penny had described. "That's it," whispered Meg. "That's it, only bigger." The hanging tendrils trapped Fran in the corner. Hardly thinking about what he was doing, Brian reached over, grabbed a pan of hot grease, and lobbed it up at the thing. The hot grease singed, and the pan hit dead center of the thing. That didn't faze it at all, but rather served to turn the thing's attention onto Brian. The shift helped Fran, but it didn't do much for Brian. The blob shot another tendril at him, and he jerked back, bumping into Meg. "Gotta get out of here," he said. They turned and ran, even as the mass of blood-clogged protoplasm overhead surged along the ceiling, smashing the overhead fluorescents and twisting the electrical conduits right out of the wall. And they headed through the hallway, plaster crashing behind them, and metal screeched. With a frizzling bang, an electrical surge blew out every light in the diner. Sparks showered down from the darkness. The back door, Brian thought. Gotta get out of here. He held tight onto Meg's hand as they careened away from the monster in the kitchen. Above them, electrical sparks hissed and danced from exploded light fixtures. Bathing in the hall in a hellish lightning, Brian was able to make out the back door, and he hurled toward it, reached it, turned the knob. Locked. Damn, he cried, even as he heard and sensed the monstrosity heaving toward them, squeezing through the hallway. Brian, cried Meg, over here, there's a stick door. She yanked open the metal handle of the walk-in freezer. Brian followed her immediately into the chill, banging the door shut behind them. The interior of the freezer was still faintly lit from its emergency batteries. To either side of them were racks of meat, frozen vegetables, and bags of French fries. Their breaths misted in front of them as they backed up against the cold metal of the room, slipping a bit on ice. Thump! The thing hit the outside of the door with booming resonance. For a moment there was silence, and then the door began to creak terribly as the creature pushed in. Slowly the door bulged in towards them, groaning. With a gasp, Meg grabbed Brian and clung to him, terrified. Brian watched helplessly as the door bowed in a little farther, breaking the seals. The blob seeped in, oozing around the straining gaps. "Oh, Brian!" gasped Meg. Brian held on to her, feeling helpless. He watched as part of the thing flopped in, and then slid a pseudopod across the floor towards them. This was it, he thought. That thing is going to get us, just like it got George, just like it got Paul and the can man, and God alone knew who else, and... Suddenly the tendril stopped. It quivered a bit, as though sensing some bad stench. Then it drew back, more slowly than it had come in. The ooze flowed away from the opening of the door, and then the creature was gone. They stood there for a while, just hanging on to each other, surprised that they were still alive. "We better wait a bit, make sure it's gone," said Brian, shivering with more than the cold. "Yes, but I don't understand. What stopped it?" "I don't know," said Brian, "but I sure as hell hope that Fran Hewitt had the sense to get out of here." Fran Hewitt couldn't move. When that horrible thing had smashed through the lights and rampaged off after those kids, she felt as though her whole body had been set into a vise, and she'd nearly fainted. What the hell was that thing? Help! She had to get some help, she dimly realized, swaying against the sideboard. With that word nagging at her, she felt a surge of adrenaline charging through her, and she was finally able to move. She didn't know how much time had passed. Not much, she supposed. But she had to get out, get help. No argument there. As she darted through the kitchen, she heard a groaning from the back of the diner, like metal contracting. She raced through the darkness of the serving area and headed for the door, stubbing her toe only once. She hit the door, and it hit back. She went down, breath half knocked from her. What? Of course, George had already locked the door, so that no other customers could come in and stop them from cleaning up. She got up and rattled the door, getting hysterical. George had the key, though, and George was... Her senses returned to her. Was there another key somewhere? She was about to fumble her way over to check the cash register when at the other end of the diner, the shadow began to move. The light from the neon sign flickered over the tops of the chairs and tables, but the chairs and tables were bobbing as though in a wave in a sea. That thing! Panicked, she grabbed the nearest chair and hurled it with all her might through the plate glass window to the left of the door. Glass exploded out, and Fran clambered through the opening, unmindful of the jagged edges that tore her uniform and scraped her skin. The breath of hot night greeted her. The end of her skirt ripping away, she ran for all she was worth down the street. Wait a moment. There was a phone booth on the other side of the block. If she cut through the alley, she could get there faster, and she could call Herb Geller. Yeah, Herb could help. Herb could see the whole goddamn army. She turned into the alley, running hard but awkwardly, knocking over garbage cans as she went. An alley cat scooted out of her path, yowling. The smell of orange rinds and coffee grinds hurled into her face as she scrambled over the pavement. Sure enough, up ahead at the end of the alley, like a beacon, was the phone booth, sitting in a pool of street lamp light. She ran the last few yards full throttle, hurtling into the booth. Oh, God, I hope I get that card he gave me. She breathed, fumbling through her pockets. Around her was all quiet, no sign of the creature, just stillness and night. Sure enough, the card was lodged right where she'd put it, by her order book. She thumped a quarter into the machine and waited for the dial tone. Nothing. Damn! Goddamn phone! She flipped the cutoff switch, got her quarter back, and tried again, this time jabbing in the numbers. Again, nothing. From the distance came the crash of glass. She jumped. looked around, still no sign of danger. But then a scream sounded. Not loud, muffled, cut off quickly. Desperately, she returned her attention to the phone, reinserting the coin and praying for the dial tone. A long, continuous humming sang from the earpiece. Quickly she pounded in the numbers. 9473711. Fran Hewitt did not notice the feelers of blood-red slime undulating down of the outside of the phone booth from above, sucking along the glass like a leech's underbelly. Not until the final number was dialed and she looked up. She screamed and immediately grabbed the handle of the door, slamming it all the way shut. The thing was dripping down over the booth like some kind of putrid melting ice cream. Fran wedged her leg against the door and grabbed up the dangling receiver to cry for help. Before she could say anything, the phone spoke. "We're sorry," said the recorded message. "Your call cannot be completed as dialed. Please hang up and try again." "No," she said, fighting down the terror. "Stay calm," she told herself. "It's all over if you don't stay calm." She managed somehow to reinsert the quarter and dial again despite her shaking fingers. She looked up and saw that gelatinous creature had totally engulfed the phone booth. Only a dim red light filtered through the pulsating slime. Then there was a ringing at the other end of the line. A hope. But even as hope swept through her, the booth's metal structure began to creak and groan as pressure was applied from the outside. Tiny red bulges of slime appeared along its joints. The ringing continued. "Please, God," said Fran. A female voice came onto the line. "Sheriff's Department." "Help me," cried Fran. "Please help me. Get the sheriff." Snap! A large, jagged crack appeared in the glass next to Fran's head. "He stepped out," said the woman. "Is it an emergency?" Another crack appeared in the glass. Fran turned towards the sound. It was as if she were at the bottom of a swimming pool of mucus. She could only make out vague forms. Something floated towards her from the gloom. No, it couldn't be. Embedded in that colloidal substance and pressing against the glass, his face already hideously dissolved, was what was left of Sheriff Herb Geller. Fran opened her mouth in horror, but before she could scream, the glass sides of the booth burst apart, and the creature poured in from above, from below, and from all sides. The sheriff billowed in on this side of pain to give her a big bloody kiss hello and start off their 11 o'clock date, dead on time. Shivering, Brian Flagg pressed his ear against the cold metal of the door. "Anything?" asked Meg Penny. "No," he said, "not a peep. But I don't know if that's a good or bad thing." He saw that she was shivering even harder. Taking off his jacket, he offered it to her. "I'm okay," she insisted. "I don't need it, so you might as well use it," he said, slipping it over her shoulders. Meg looked away, but Brian saw the tears welling up in her eyes. "Hey," he said, "don't worry. We're going to get out of this." She turned to him and put her arms around him. They stood together for a time like that. She was warm and soft in his embrace, and something about the way she held him touched Brian Flagg deeply. Sensing that this was no time to hold back, that they could both use whatever comfort they could offer one another, he hugged her close, giving and taking. Long seconds passed, and he said, "We'd better go." "Yeah." "You ready?" he said. Not really. Neither was he, but nothing ventured, nothing gained. He grabbed a meat hook from one of the racks and unlatched the door, ready to slam it back at the slightest hint of attack. They stepped outside and moved cautiously down the hallway. The place was a total mess, with overturned shelves, ruined lights, and the dark stain of blood splattered over the walls like obscene graffiti. "Franny?" called Brian. "Franny!" There was no answer. He pulled Meg along beside him. Holding onto the side of a shelf, he peered into the dining room. "She's gone," he said, stepping forward and immediately slipping on something. He staggered forward and bumped into something on the shelf. In the darkness, he could feel a gooey tendril flop onto his neck, sticky and warm. "Brian!" Meg cried. Brian lurched to the side, striking out with the meat hook as he fell back against the wall. He turned to face his attacker, and he saw the open tin of jam falling from the shelf above. It landed at his feet, splattering. "Great," said Brian. "I killed the strawberry jam." "Let's get out of here," said Meg, which was truly an excellent idea. The Reverend Frederick Meeker, minister of the only Lutheran church in Morgan City, stepped from the doorway of the church, turned and locked it. He'd been working in the church library, double-checking some tricky references he needed to document his Sunday sermon. He always liked to include the names of books, along, of course, with the chapters and verses from which his texts were taken, so that his parishioners could delve deeper if they were so inclined. The Reverend Meeker prided himself that he was not one of those thud-and-blunder preachers, thumping the good book over the heads of his flock. His sermons stood not only in the rock of God, but upon mountains of scholarly work available to anyone who cared to explore. But he just wished that more people did care. It seemed like everyone was sinking into a morass, not just of sin, but of ignorance, especially the youth of today. Like that incident in the Rexall today with young Scott Jeske and his purchase of those prophylactics. If the youth of today took their minds off sexual pursuits and put them into learning, well, then the world would be a better place. He was just turning away from the ornate wooden doors of the church when he heard the tinkle of broken glass. Down the road, a block and a half, was the establishment known as the Tick-Tock Diner, a rude and crude blemish on the community. But it was from the opposite side of the Tick-Tock's block that the oddest sight came. Where there had once been a phone booth, there was now a twisted frame of metal and shattered glass, and some kind of reddish water was pouring from the booth, slipping into the gutter and washing down into the sewer grill on the curb. What was that thing? "Merciful God," he cried as a shudder gripped him. It didn't move like water, it moved like something that was alive. He was about to turn, go back into the church and call the authorities, when a second, louder crash distracted his attention back to the diner. There the front door was being kicked out. Two figures appeared. The Reverend recognized both Brian Flagg and Meg Penny, but before he could call out to them, they raced off into the darkness. What in heaven's name was going on at the Tick-Tock Diner? He decided he'd better go and check. Somebody might need help. He was 44 years old, but he kept himself in shape with a regular exercise program at the local Young Men's Christian Association. In no time, he was all in front of the Tick-Tock, where he discovered that the front door wasn't the only thing broken. The plate glass window off to the right was smashed, with a chair lying in the bushes below it. From inside the diner, he heard a low moaning. "Hello?" he said. He entered the darkness, almost immediately thumping his shin against the door. "Ouch," he said, suppressing a curse. The lights weren't working in here, so he took out his keychain, which had a small pocket flash attached. The small beam provided enough light for him to pick his way through the scattered tables and chairs. "Is anybody in there? Is anybody hurt?" No response. He found the door into the kitchen and entered. Up ahead at the end of the hallway he could see a shaft of light. He made for it, but was stopped by the moaning sound again, close by, higher in pitch, and rising. He swung the light beam around and caught the glow of the eyes of an alley cat licking a spill of gravy and meat from the floor. He exhaled, relieved. Just a cat. He turned back, then opened the door that spilled of light. As he approached it, he could tell it was a freezer door, wide open, letting out light and cold. He looked inside. Nothing but food racks, hanging meat, and... Oh, wait a second. How odd. In front of the door were frozen chunks of some unidentifiable substance that glittered like fine jewelry in the light. Fascinating. Maybe Abner Abel down at the university would be able to make something of these things. He looked around and found a shelf holding a few mason jars. He opened one, crouched down, and scooped up the rough, magical-looking things, like chunks of rubies they were. He fastened the top back of the jar and carried his strange prize away. Meanwhile, at the sheriff's office, Meg Penny and Brian Flagg rushed in to get some much-needed help. Brian realized that he was the first time he'd ever been there and wanted to see Sheriff Herb Geller. But instead of the sheriff, they found themselves confronted by a frazzled Sally Jeffers sitting at a lit-up phone console, overwhelmed by incoming calls. "We have to see the sheriff," said Meg. "I don't know where he is," said Sally, punching a phone line. "Sheriff's station, please hold," she said into the mic in front of her mouth. "What about Briggs?" demanded Brian. Sally pointed at the radio. "I can't raise anybody. All I'm getting is static." She punched another line. "Sheriff's station, please hold." Then she turned back to Brian and Meg. "Last I heard from the deputy, he was heading up to Elkins Grove to check out some disturbance." She punched a button and spoke into the mic again. "Sorry to keep you waiting." Meg turned to Brian. "Elkins Grove. That's where I found the old man." They rushed out of the station, got back in Meg's VW, and zoomed into the night. The patrol car was parked on the side of the road in a long swath of tall grass just before the woods. "Look over there," Meg said, directing Brian's attention. She parked and they got out, approaching the patrol car cautiously. The driver's door hung partially open. "Looks like he left in a hurry," said Meg. Brian looked suspiciously into the black and white car. That was the same place where he'd run into the stricken can man. Just about the same place where the can man had run into the road in front of Meg and Paul. Brian looked out into the woods. "Yo, Briggs!" he called. Into the woods, crickets chirped, nothing more. "He's up there somewhere," he said to Meg. "In the woods. In the dark woods." "Right. I guess we could wait here." Meg sighed. Well, that thing wipes out the whole town? She started up the incline, and Brian Flagg followed her, muttering to himself, I never thought I'd go out of my way to find a cop. They wended their way through the stick underbrush. The pale moonlight filtered through the thick latticework of branches overhead, highlighting the shallow ground fog that had been building as they progressed. Brian bumped his head into a low-hanging branch. I feel like fucking Hansel and Gretel out here, he complained. We should have brought some breadcrumbs. Shh, said Meg. I think I hear something. There was something, realized Brian. They stood still, listening to it. A distant thrumming sound fading in and out of the silence of the night. What the hell is that? Brian asked. Meg shook her head, and they were a little farther before the rumbling sound stopped them in their tracks again. Boy, that sounds giving me the willies, said Brian. Meg looked around apprehensively. Suddenly a bright light flared up deep in the woods, suffusing the sky above them with a white glow. Brian started backing away, pulling Meg with him. Maybe we should get out of here, he suggested. Maybe you're right, said Meg. But before they could get upon their course, the vibration in the air grew deeper and louder. The light approached, sending moving shafts through the trees, turning night into artificial day. An unnatural wind kicked up suddenly, whipping the foliage into a frenzy. Brian felt the sudden urge to run. The light swept over them, and a descending wind almost knocked him down. He lost sight of Meg. He spun around, looking for her, and it was then that he saw the men. Or at least he supposed they were men. After the events of the evening, there was no telling what was right anymore. There were 6 of them, and they were coming down the ridge towards Brian and Meg, silhouetted in the blinding light, approaching through the wind-whipped mist like figures in a dream. A blazing row of lights rose up from them behind them, hovering in the air, spotlights sweeping the night. Brian and Meg crouched down against the wind. Then Brian knew for sure what he had merely suspected before. There was a helicopter up there. A damned high-tech job at that. As the 6 men approached, Brian could see that they looked so weird because they were dressed in white plastic suits that covered every inch of their bodies. They looked out of clear plastic faceplates, and they apparently talked through the small speakers slotted just below their necks. The sight of them gave Brian goosebumps. Ever seen anything like this? He asked Meg. Yeah, in E.T. All in all, said Brian, I'd rather go home. One of the men separated from the others and neared the couple. Brian could see the man's face clearly through the faceplate. This was an elderly dude wearing a smile and a twinkle in his eye. Don't be frightened, he said. His voice doubled as it filtered through the headgear and issued from the speaker as well. We're here to help you. And all dressed up for the occasion, said Brian. Please, come this way, said the old guy, as the others hustled around the pair and pointed the direction they wanted them to go. Well, so much for free choice, said Meg. They were briskly escorted through the woods, over the ridge, and into a clearing where all kind of people in white plastic suits bustled around like worker ants among a profusion of lights, vehicles, and machines. As soon as they entered this odd bivouac, a man and a woman with clipboards joined the marching white suits and barraged Brian and Meg with questions. Look, who are you people? Demanded Brian. Name, the woman asked Meg. Meg Penny, she responded. Name, the man asked Brian. Meg Penny, he pointed at his companion. She's an imposter. Someone had popped up from nowhere and was trying to fit a blood pressure sleeve over her arm. Brian batted it away. Get that stuff off of her. Are you a resident of Morgan City, Meg? Asked the woman. Yes. Have you ever been high blood pressure or heart disease? No. How about you, sir? Asked the other guy with the clipboard. Diabetes? No thanks, quipped Brian. I'm trying to cut down. Have you been experiencing any vomiting, nausea, or diarrhea? The woman asked Meg. Not until she got a look at you guys. This isn't getting us anywhere, thought Brian. That old geezer, he's clearly in charge. The older man was leading the troop through the vehicle encampment. Brian broke free of the men in white and fell in step with the leader. Hey, you want to fill us in, pal? He said. Who the hell are you people? Oh, sorry. Identifications are in order, I suppose. I'm Dr. Trimble. I head this group. We're a government-sanctioned biological containment team. Meg heard that as well. Biological containment? We're microbe hunters, young lady, Dr. Trimble said. He was about to tell them more when they were suddenly interrupted by a yell from one of the vehicles. Flag! Brian looked up. Who should it be but Deputy Bill Briggs? He was escorted by a somber-looking chisel face sporting a .45 Colt automatic on the hip of his white suit. What are you doing here, boy? Briggs demanded. The men from Glad here are showing us how to keep our leftovers fresh. Briggs wagged a finger. These people are here on serious business. They don't have time for your bullshit, understand? Dr. Trimble turned to the man escorting Briggs. "Colonel, has the deputy been briefed in detail?" "Yes, sir," said the gun-toting man. "I'm heading back into town now to get things started," said Briggs. "Splendid," said Dr. Trimble. "Colonel Hargis will arrange an escort." After shooting Brian a glower, Briggs continued on with Colonel Hargis. Brian noticed a great deal of activity off to the right, where a number of trees had apparently been burned. When they walked closer, he could see there was a big charred hole in the ground, still steaming slightly. The smell of the air was of burnt trees, and something more hung in the night air. "What's going on there?" Meg said, indicating the white suits setting up equipment and lights near the smoking hole. "That's the source of our worries," said Dr. Trimble insistently. "A troublesome little souvenir from space. A mote in God's eye." "What?" "A meteor," said Dr. Trimble. Meg moved forward, fascinated by the sight, but Trimble reached out a glove and gently restrained her. "Don't get too close," he said. "There's danger of contamination." "I don't understand," said Meg. Trimble turned to them, and his features were clearer now in the light. He had a handsome, well-preserved face, even though Brian figured the old bird must be at least 70, judging by the gray hair, the wrinkles, and the gauntness. But the old guy seemed spry and lively, bursting with energy. His blue, expressive eyes darted here and there as he talked, and there was an enthusiasm and an excitement in gesture. "I'll make it simple," Dr. Trimble began. "The dinosaurs ruled the earth for millions of years, and yet they died out almost overnight. Why?" Meg shrugged. It was way past Brian, too. "The evidence points to a meteor, or maybe an asteroid that fell, bringing alien bacteria with it. Bacteria to which there was no natural immunity, just like in H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds." "Plague?" said Meg. "Is that what this is all about?" The scientist shook his head, smiling. "No, prevention. Think of us as that apple a day that keeps the doctor away. We look for possible infection from outer space, and if it comes, we make sure it doesn't spread." "And you think your meteor brought some killer germ from outer space?" The man's eyes looked up to the sky, and he spoke in a breathless tone. "It's something I've expected and prepared for all of my life." Brian shook his head. "Oh boy, you got a surprise coming, Buster." He'd figured it all out by now. This was what the can man had been babbling about. The light from the sky, the meteor, that thing on his hand. He must have picked it up from the meteor steaming now in the ground. "That meteor brought something, all right. But if it's a germ, it's the biggest son of a bitch you've ever seen." "And getting bigger," Meg added. Brian was surprised at the white suit's reaction. All the plastic faceplates swung their way, and the buzzing talk ceased. Dr. Trimble's eyes got very big as he turned to face them, like somebody who'd just been told he'd won a jackpot. "Would you care to enlighten me?" he requested. Meg and Brian looked at each other. How could they describe what they'd been through? "You better start with Paul and the can man, Meg," said Brian, "and then I'll pick up from there." She nodded and proceeded to tell the story, starting with that glistening glob on the hand of the can man. The scientist stayed stock still as he listened to how the thing had grown, how it had attacked and eaten Paul, how no one would believe what Meg had seen. And then Brian took over. He told of the huge thing in the Tick-Tock diner, and how it had pulled George Ruiz into the sink, and how it had moved like a son of a bitch, almost getting them. It's the most horrible thing I've ever seen," said Brian. "It's like Dr. Frankenstein dumped all the spittoons in the world into one smelly glob, and then stuck the electrodes in." Dr. Trimble nodded. Most curious," he said. "We're telling you how people have been horribly dissolved by that thing," said Meg, "and all you have to say is, 'most curious'?" "Forgive my emotional detachment, but it comes with the job. Biologically speaking, you must understand, I deal with much death in many horrible ways. Cancer, disease of various sorts, AIDS, what have you. I know them all too well, but this," he stuck a finger in the air, "this is something quite different, it would seem. All those are diseases that strike from within. This giant amoeboid seems to strike from without. And as it absorbs its victims, so its mass and cellular content expand. But the question is, my friend, is it single-celled or multi-celled? Its rate of growth suggests single-celled, and yet it is like nothing that exists in nature. By the way, did you notice the presence of a nucleus?" "He means like the brain," said Meg. "All I saw floating in that thing were pieces of bodies," said Brian. "How about flagella?" "Huh?" "Like long antennae," said Meg. "You mean like paramecia?" "Aha, the young lady has taken biology. Excellent. Perhaps I should direct my question to you." "No antenna, sir. Nothing like a paramecium. But come to think of it, it was kind of like the things we look at under microscopes. Only it doesn't seem to have any skin. A giant amoeba without a membrane. Well, that is something. That's not to say it is an amoeba, but I think that we can assume that it's a single-celled animal. The DNA structure must be very simple, yet terribly elegant to promote an eating machine of this magnitude. "You believe us?" said Meg, just beginning to comprehend that they were being taken seriously. "Yes, my dear, I believe you. Everything you have said confirms the existence of this thing, this horrid yet fascinating blob, and there may even be more to it than we know." As they were talking, more equipment and vehicles had arrived. Brian turned around, noticing for the first time that a windowless van had pulled up behind them. "I can't begin to thank you both," Dr. Trimble was saying. "This information is incredibly valuable." He went to the van and opened a back door. "Please, get in." "And where are we going?" asked Meg. "Back to town," said Dr. Trimble. "Morgan City is under quarantine until we've isolated that organism and checked every living soul for signs of infection. As I mentioned before, we are a contaminating unit. We don't want any disease to spread." But Brian didn't like the sound of this. He stayed put. "In the meantime, we're your prisoners." "Nonsense," said Dr. Trimble. "You're my patients." "Sounds like the same thing to me." "Brian," said Meg, already getting in. "Young man," said the scientist, getting stern, "I'm far too busy to debate the point with you. Now please step into the van." Meg stepped back, down, and grabbed Brian by the arm, but Brian insisted on backing away towards the woods, dragging Meg along with him. "Look, thanks for the offer, Doc, but my bike's right over there, and we can make it back on our own." He waved goodbye with his free hand. "By the way, love your tailor. I gotta get me one of those." He turned around and ran smack into the broad-shouldered Colonel Hargis, accompanied by two other husky white-suited soldiers gripping M16s. Tall, too. They loomed over Brian Flagg like twin sentinels. "Get in the van," rumbled Colonel Hargis in a voice like God's. Brian recognized the tone immediately and knew that this was no time for rebellion. "All right. Van ride sounds nice." He and Meg clambered in, and the door immediately slammed shut behind them. Brian could hear the colonel bellowing outside, "Get these civilians to the relief station, ASAP." "Yes, sir," came the response. Brian sat down on one of the benches in the windowless compartment. A dim light shone near the cab of the van. A few moments later, the engine started and the van jumped and rumbled towards its destination. Brian stared at the door a moment, then smiled over to Meg. He got up and tried it. "It's locked," he reported to his companion. "So what?" She was sitting clearly tired on her bench as though relieved to be there. "Brian, what's with you? You're acting like a complete jerk." "I have a problem with authority figures." He checked his back pocket. Sure enough, Moss's ratchet was still there. He supposed he had a good enough excuse for not giving it back to him this time. He pulled the tool out and started working on the lock. "What are you doing?" Meg demanded. "I think we should get out of here," he said. "What?" "We gotta get on my bike and blow this town. Things are getting a little thick." "Brian, that's crazy. These people are here to help us." "Come on, Meg. We don't even know who they are." "NASA, CIA, the Royal Canadian Mounties. All I saw were a bunch of unmarked trucks. I think this whole thing stinks." "We can't just run out. Let's think of it as looking out for our best interests." The lock clicked free. Brian pushed on the door. It opened. He turned to Meg. "You coming?" She wore a look of resolve on her face. "I have to go back, Brian. My family's there. People I care about." "Well, I'm going. If you're smart, you'll come with me." She looked at him crossly, speaking bitterly. "Then go. Take care of yourself. It's the only thing you're really good at, ain't it?" This hurt worse than he'd have expected it to. "Nobody else ever volunteered for the job," he murmured, turning and checking outside. He didn't want to get run over by a truck cruising along behind, but there was no truck, and the ground that was trundling by wasn't passing too fast. A good jump would be a cinch. Then it got even better. The van slowed for a turn, and Brian jumped without even turning to say goodbye to Meg. He hit the ground, tucked himself into a ball, and rolled into the roadside brush. The world whizzed around him for a time, then stilled. He picked himself up, and he brushed himself off. The van bumped along toward Morgan City. Meg Penny had already closed the door. Brian watched for a moment. "Christ Flag," he muttered in disgust. "A cheerleader?" Then he turned and started walking to Elkins Grove, where all this had started, and where his bike waited.